Alrighty, so today I'd like to go ahead and discuss the next imaging modality, as it's called, the next imaging technique, which is CT scans. Now, sometimes, of course, most of the time, you'll hear people refer to it as CAT scans. And what CAT scans, CAT, this acronym, stands for is computerized axial tomography. So that's what CAT scans, CAT part of it, and of course its shortened name CT scans stand for. Now, of course, in order to discuss CT scans, we first should discuss why CT scanning was even necessary. After all, we, in terms of humans, had just discovered X-ray imaging, how to use X-rays in the medical or health sciences, as well as other areas. For instance, X-rays are used to discover faults or cracks in materials. So if you have, if you're building a bridge, and you, of course, construct it out of a bunch of smaller pieces, you want to make sure that the manufacturing of those pieces is as sturdy and strong as possible and don't have some hidden imperfections. Because, of course, if there's imperfections, those are weak points. And so it's not always easy to see if there are weak points. Sometimes they're hidden, sometimes they're deep within the material rather than the outside of the material. And X-rays allowed scientists to be able to go ahead and analyze those structures for these types of weaknesses. So X-rays were used in a lot of fields. However, in terms of health, obviously X-ray imaging was a big thing. But it had its limitations. And so the limitations is something important to realize as to why, of course, we decided, or scientists, kept looking for new techniques for these imagings. So first of all, if you think about what an X-ray machine does, an X-ray image, what is it? Well, let's say you have your little X-ray generator over here on the left, and it's shooting X-rays over. And you have a person, their body, of course, standing over here, and they're looking to the side like that towards the X-ray machine. And those X-rays pass through the person, and over here you have the film. And what creates the image on this film is those X-rays which are able to pass through the body get imprinted on this film. And of course, the X-rays which are absorbed by the body don't make it to the film. And so what it is you see on an actual X-ray image is basically a measure of how many or how much X-ray radiation was absorbed by the body and how much was passed through. And this absorption is called X-ray attenuation. I don't know if you've ever heard the word attenuation, but it kind of has this feel, this sound of like putting down or reducing an effect or something like that is kind of, in my mind, when I hear attenuation, you're attenuating the circumstances. You're kind of reducing its effectiveness. Well, what it really means in this case is, of course, when an X-ray passes through the body and it's passing through the different materials, depending on its energy, it'll either be able to go through or it will be absorbed at some point. And of course, the different materials have different densities, and it's the density which tells you whether an X-ray can make it through or not, relative to its energy. Obviously, very high-level X-rays can pass through more material than low-energy X-rays can. And of course, when you have different materials, you'll have air on the one hand, air in your lungs. Well, air doesn't really absorb X-rays. X-rays can just pass right through. But then, of course, you have bone, and bone is a very, very dense substance, relatively speaking, and so bone will absorb those X-rays because those X-rays just don't have enough energy to make it through. They will eventually be absorbed. And so what you see on this image is kind of the difference in attenuation throughout the body. The problem is that X-ray film, which is what X-rays are imprinted on, doesn't do a very good job of showing the difference between different attenuations. And so we can't get very, very detailed. I like to use the word resolution, but I don't mean resolution in terms of this part of the body right next to that part of the body. Can we see the difference in space? That's resolution. But in terms of this particular organ has this density, and the organ right next to it is very close in density, but not quite as dense. And so it won't absorb quite as many X-rays. Well, what you would expect is something that's very, very dense. No X-rays will make it through, so when you look at the picture, after you've developed it, it'll be very white. Whereas, if you have a part of the body that allowed the X-rays through without being absorbed, X-rays are imparted onto the film, you develop the film, and that part becomes black. That's where the X-rays actually hit. But, of course, it's all black and white, and so you're looking at different shades of gray and trying to determine, oh, this must be this organ because its gray level is a little darker or a little lighter than that other gray level. But, as I said, film doesn't do a very good job of showing differences between very close densities. And in fact, really, there's pretty much 5 levels of attenuation that you can see in an X-ray. You have first air. Of course, air is the least dense. And so when X-rays pass through a portion of the body which is filled with air, all the X-rays make it through. And so when you look at the picture, it'll be as dark black as possible because X-rays were passed through, it hits the film, and where the X-rays hit the film, it's a black spot. And so more X-rays that hit, bigger region of black area. Then a slight, a level up in density from there is fat. So fat is, of course, more dense than air, but it's still lightly dense. It's not that dense. That's why, by the way, fat floats in water, or oil is a form of fat. Oil rises to the top in the water because it's less dense than water. And so you would expect to see like a dark gray color on the X-ray image if the part of the body you're looking at is fat. Then you have water and soft tissue. And here is a big problem. Soft tissue and water are very close in density. Or I should say, they're very close in attenuation. So how well they absorb X-rays, they're very, very close. And in fact, when you look on an X-ray image, you really can't tell the difference. They look to be the same color or the same shade. A step more dense than that is bone. And so when you are looking at an image, the bones in the body will show up white relative to the background. Because most of the X-rays, if not all, but most of them, will be absorbed by the bones. And then finally, the most dense is metal. And, naturally there's no metal in your body, but what you'll find is when they do an X-ray they usually have like a not a scale, but they'll put a metal thing in the image. So, usually it'll be like the letter R, let's say, and it'll be, when the image comes up, it looks backwards because, of course, when they develop it, it's a mirror image. But it'll be in a metal letter or symbol to first of all tell you which side is which. So when you look at the image, of course, you're symmetric. How do you know it's the left side of the body or the right side? Well, they'll put something that will completely absorb all the X-rays when it hits that particular piece, that particular symbol. It'll show up extremely bright white, so you can see it, and okay, this is what metal is. This is the most absorbed of all the X-ray, of all the materials. And so relative to that, you can tell the difference with lesser dense materials. But really, these are the 5 kind of materials that you can distinguish in an X-ray image. Now, of course, the heart has a different density than the liver or the kidneys or the stomach. And but they're so close to each other that when you actually look at the picture, because the film itself doesn't do a very good job of distinguishing those attenuations for those different densities, they all have the same color. So, of course, you need a professional, someone who knows the body, to say, well, yeah, I can't tell just by looking at the color, but by its placement. Is it on the left side of the body or the right side of the body? Is it upper chest or is it lower down towards the intestines? Things like this. They'll be able to tell which organ is which by its placement, but you can't tell necessarily by its color. So that's one big limitation here. It's not very good at distinguishing between the different densities in the body unless there's stark differences, like bone versus muscle. Another limitation, of course, is the fact that you're passing these X-rays, I'll leave it here, passing these X-rays through the body, and the body is 3-dimensional. But the image you get is a 2-dimensional image. And of course, we know that in the body, the organs and the different materials inside are placed in, different locations. So, for instance, you'll have the heart in the chest, but there's the rib cage in front of the heart. Or you'll have the stomach, and then behind the stomach is the spinal column. So, spatially, these organs are in different locations, but as the X-rays pass through and they get put onto this film, there's no way of seeing what was in front of the other. Everything is just placed on top of each other. And so again, you don't get a feel for which of these gray shapes I see on my image was in front, which was in back. If you want to see the heart, for instance, and the rib cage is in the way, the bones of the rib cage, well, there's going to be certain parts of the heart that you don't see, because as the X-rays tried to pass through to hit the heart, they first had to make it through the bones in the rib cage. But the bones, of course, absorb all the X-rays. So where the rib cage goes across in front of the heart, no X-rays can actually make it past the bones and into the heart and then through to the film. And so you'll have things blocking other things which are behind them. And so these are, really big issues when trying to get good information about the inside of the body. So people needed a way to try to overcome some of these limitations. What can we do to help this? How can we create an image where I can tell the difference between the front and the back? I could see this organ without having something blocking it or something messing with it. Well, what winds up happening is a man named Godfrey Hounsfield. British man, is working, he's actually in the British Royal Air Force in World War II. Royal Air Force. He's working as an engineer. And he's working on radar. How to use radar, for instance, to detect airplanes and bombers and things coming. And so a lot of his work and research was in the form of radar, and of course radar is similar to X-rays in that radiation is being sent. Those particles of radiation will either be absorbed by the material or reflected back, and you use that to create an image. Well, after the war, in the late 50s, he went to work with a place called EMI Labs. This is in the 50s. And EMI, of course, if it sounds familiar, it's basically the record label for the Beatles when they were starting up. And they used the money, or they used a lot of money from that venture to fund a lot of research and scientific research and things like that. And so his job there at EMI Labs was to work as a chief scientist in charge of their computers. Now, this is a big deal in the 50s. Computers are brand new. These are new things. Nothing like the computers of today, of course. But they hired him to try to come up with ways of using the computer in new ways other than just calculators. And so he was thinking of, okay, well, how can we use this stuff, computers and technology and things, in other areas? And it turns out that he decided to go ahead and see if there's a way of using the computer in the health sciences. And so that's what he turned his attention to. In fact, he looked into radiology, which is, of course, the study that involves X-rays at the time. So, being a scientist, he knew about some theoretical investigations by mathematicians. In fact, one mathematician named Johann Radon described what's called a transform, which is basically a mathematical technique that allowed you to take a higher dimensional object and reconstruct this higher dimensional object by looking at multiple views of lower dimensional pieces. So his transform was able to, it's a mathematical technique, so it's a bunch of equations. You look at you take a bunch of slices, or you take a bunch of different views, and you do some kind of a mathematical process on the information you get from those views, and that tells you about its higher dimensional totality. This is a big deal for, to prove that it's possible and to be able to do it. In terms of one of the big limitations of X-rays. Now, how is this true? Well, think about one of the limitations, the fact that I can't tell If I'm trying to look at a particular organ in the body, but there's other organs in front of it and other organs behind it, when I get this image that's two-dimensional, everything's flat and everything's all, bundled together. How am I able to tell what's the thing I'm looking for and what's the other stuff that's in the way? What are the shadows cast by the other organs? Or how do I know that this dark spot that shouldn't be there on the organ I'm looking at didn't come from one of the things in front or behind, but rather came from that particular thing? And so the thought was, well, maybe, mathematically speaking, what we can do is a pretty, intuitive process. For instance, let's say I have a cube. Okay, so here's a little sketch of a cube. And I want to take an image of this cube, but of course it's three-dimensional. Well, what I can do is, I want to get across to somebody what the cube looks like, the whole cube. So what I can do is I could say, okay, let me take a picture of its front. And the front, of course, looks like this. You're just looking straight at the front face. And then I say, okay, let me look at the side view. And the side view may look like this. And then I'll look at the top view. And the top view may look like this. And then if I give this to someone and I say, okay, I have some object where the front of the object looks like this. So if I look straight at the front, this is all I see. And when I look straight from the side, it looks like this. And when I look from the top down, it looks like that. Create this object for me. Make a model of what this looks like in 3 dimensions. And if you know the process, if this is what you do for a living, you'd be able to recreate from these images the original 3-dimensional object, or a representation of it. And so what this is doing is it's saying, look, I have this 3-dimensional object, but if I take some views, some 2-dimensional views, because notice the original object's 3D, it's got left, right, up, down, back, front. Well, here I could take 2D objects, which are just, up, down, and left, right pictures. But I take multiple of them. I can combine those 2-dimensional images, those 2-dimensional information, and create the higher dimensional original object. So the thought was, well, if that's true, let's do it for the body. What if we took the body, sent X-rays through, but sent it through from multiple angles, get the images from all those multiple angles, and then using this mathematical technique, recreate the 3-dimensional view of the body. So I can see what's in front of what's to the side of what, and things like this. That was the plan. And the reason it hadn't happened before is because the mathematical process in doing such a thing, and doing it in such a way as you're detailed and you see good high resolution, the difference between one thing and another, spatially, if they're very close together, all this kind of stuff, required heavy computing power. And so the invention of computers that could do these calculations for you faster than a human could was integral to this. Without them, this couldn't be done. So, in the 1960s, Hounsfield created his first prototype. He felt it could be done, so he wanted to prove it could be done. Now, of course, as is generally true, you work on a basic version. not the most complex version. And so he wanted to just prove the point that something like this would be possible. And so what he did was he took a radioactive source. So let's say, here's the source here. Little gun. Inside is a material, radioactive material called americium. So it's radioactive. It's going to give off radiation. And it's sent off as a beam of radiation. And then across from this radioactive source, he had a bench, like a tabletop. On this bench was like a circular platter that can be rotated, and it can be slid side to side. And on this table thing, this round tabletop, he had different objects in different placements, different materials. And so what he wanted to do, and then of course on this side is the detector. So what he wanted to do was to make an image, recreate an image that shows these materials and show where they are relative to each other. So instead of having, an X-ray, which would just basically have, a big old blob, because everything is sent through, all the X-rays just get passed through, and so the thing that hits this front piece also hits this piece and then the back piece, and so you get a dot there that represents all three. So instead of that, he wanted an image that would show exactly as it looks here on the table. There's one object, and then behind it, there's space, and then another object. And so the way he would do it is, or the way this prototype would work, is this beam of radiation is being passed through, goes to the detector. This tabletop with the materials slides through this beam, and so as one of the materials runs through the beam, that beam now is being absorbed somewhat, depending on the material, how dense it is. It's being absorbed, and thus not as many X-rays will make it through to the detector. And then you keep sliding it through, and then you get off that material and into the next material, and so forth, and until you've passed the whole tabletop through, and you've done the whole run. Then you rotate it. You rotate the table, or the round tabletop, by 1 degree. So slide it through. Then rotate by 1 degree. And then slide it back down through the beam again. And then rotate it again 1 degree and slide it through. Rotate, slide it through. And you keep doing it until you've rotated a full 180 degrees. So by the time you're done, this back material is now in the front, and the front material is now in the back. You've gone all the way around this object, and the whole time this detector is picking up how much X-ray is being attenuated, how much is being sent through. Then you take all that data from this detector, run it through his business computer, which basically means this computer would have to solve a system of equations of something like 28,000 equations and 28,000 unknowns. So, of course, by now in physics, You're used to, two equations, two unknowns, three equations, three unknowns, things like this. We oftentimes have these systems of equations where, you may want to know how far an object went, but in order to figure it out, so you want the distance, you also need to know maybe the speed, or you need to know the time it takes. And you don't know that either. So you have two kinematics equations you have to work on. Those two kinematics equations have your two unknowns in them, and so you have to solve that linear system of equations. Well, imagine 28,000 linear equations all at once, and you have to solve something like that. That's why this type of thing was never done, because it's just way too difficult, way too time-consuming for someone to sit down with 28,000 equations and 28,000 unknowns. And in fact, even for the computer, at the time it was a supercomputer, it took 2.5 hours to solve all of those equations, even for a computer. And in fact, the whole process, from beginning to end, took 9 days. That's how long it took to image and then run it through the computer and get an answer. Now, the good news is, of course, it came out correct. They were able to reproduce an image that showed the relative distances between the objects. You were able to see this object absorbed this much rather than this object. You could distinguish in space the different objects and how much they attenuated the X-rays. So it was a success, but of course, it's not perfect. I mean, imagine you have to go get a CAT scan done. You have to sit in this machine perfectly still for 9 days to try to get, and this is just to get one single image. So obviously, while the prototype was a success in showing that this is feasible, this is possible to do, they had to come up with a way to make it better. And so, of course, they did. Their second prototype, they changed the original radioactive source, the americium, to an actual X-ray generator, which allowed them to send way more X-rays all at once, or in a shorter period of time, than the normal radioactive piece of material just sitting there. So that allowed you to take faster pictures. More X-rays bombarding the material means you can get through the picture a lot faster. You don't have to wait so long to produce enough X-rays to see a picture, to see an image. Now, of course, they still had the translate and rotate thing, but at least this allowed them to create the image faster. Secondly, they also changed the mathematical technique. They made it way more efficient so that the computer didn't have to work so hard. You didn't have 28,000 equations and unknowns. Instead, you would use what's called filtered back projection. This is the new mathematical technique they would use. Once they got the image, once they got all the data through the detector, and they fed it to the computer, filtered back projection is the name of the mathematical technique. And basically what it means is this. Imagine you have a material, and let's say, this box of the material is fairly dark, this is pretty light, this bottom left is completely light, and this is kind of dark as well. And so when you send your X-rays through, what you get on the film over here, this X-ray coming on the top hits this cell and produces a box that looks a little darker than the first cell because a little bit more was absorbed by the second. And then down here, this X-ray on the bottom passing through his two cells, the first cell doesn't absorb anything, the second one just absorbs what it does, so it'll look a certain darkness. And then they would shift and go, let's say, this way, sending X-rays that way, and you'd have your little film over here. And so now this X-ray is going through this first cell and then that cell, and it produces some color over here, and so on. And then what makes it back projection is they would then send, mathematically speaking, these images back through the original thing you were taking an image of to reproduce what the original image looked like. It was a much more efficient mathematical process of doing it. And in fact, it's so efficient that this is the technique that's still used today. This process of taking the data from the detector, this much was absorbed by these cells from this angle, this much is absorbed by these cells from this angle, and you go through multiple angles. You send that information back through where it came from, and you reproduce what the original thing must have looked like. And so this was very, very big. Of course, the X-ray generator made the imaging part of it faster, but the filtered back projection technique made the mathematical process a lot faster, and thus a lot cheaper. Remember, at the time, and even to this day, when you have supercomputers, the most powerful of powerful computers in existence, there's not very many of them. And so people fight and argue and try to use those computers for their own work. But since there's a limited amount of these computers, it becomes expensive to use them. Supply and demand. There's a high demand for the computers, but very few, a low supply. It's going to cost more. Well, in creating a mathematical technique, that means you don't spend as much time on the computer. That's a good thing. The computer's not used up. Other people can use it. It's not as expensive for you to use. These are very good things. Now, of course, it's not perfect, as I said. It still took a long time relative to the way things are now. And in fact, it took long enough where pretty much the only thing that could be scanned, that could be imaged, was the head, the skull. Now, this is a very good thing because X-rays could not penetrate the skull to look at the brain. The way the brain is encapsulated by the hard skull, of course, the bone absorb almost all the X-rays, so nothing can get through. And it's like having a shield blocking your view of the brain. Also, on top of that, even if you could look in, the fact that the brain is surrounded by a fluid, the cerebrospinal fluid, and that fluid happens to have the same type of attenuation as the brain's material itself, meant that when doing X-ray imaging, no one was able to see what the brain looked like. You still can only look at the brain and study it by opening up the head and physically looking, and so, of course, that's dangerous for a living person. Or you get a dead person's brain, but then, of course, the brain may not be healthy at that point, depending on how long ago the person died, how they died, things like this. Well, with CAT scans, this new technique of being able to three-dimensionally image how it was done, and this mathematical technique of being able to figure out the information spatially, what was in front of what, this cell is in front of that cell, but this one absorbs more than that one, and not only is it true, but I can tell by the information that it's true. And so I can recreate the original object with that first cell absorbing more than the second. With an X-ray, there's no way for you to know which cell absorbed more. So at the time, you could just basically stick the person's head into the machine and take a picture. As I said, the reason is since it took so long, you couldn't do a chest CAT scan because you have to breathe. And, you know, when you're taking a picture, you know, you've seen pictures. If there's someone moving in a picture, they look blurry. They're smeared because as you're taking the picture, you're letting light hit the film. You're letting light come into the camera. Well, it's not an instantaneous, at one single instant, this much light comes in. It's spread over a short period of time. Well, over that small period of time, the person may have moved somewhat, and so where the light came from moved as well, and so you get this smeared look on the picture. Well, if you're sitting there in a CAT scan machine, and you want to take a picture of your lungs or something like that, if it takes a long time, you can't hold your breath for long enough, and so you'll get very blurry images and you can't see. So basically, it was only good at the time for things like imaging the skull, the brain, and stuff like that. It was still a good thing because the only other way to image the brain at the time, X-rays couldn't do it. So what they had to do were other things like a pneumocephalogram and things like this. But those techniques were painful, nauseating. You'd get into a chair and they basically pump air bubbles into your brain and move you around, flip you upside down and all sorts of stuff to try to move the air bubble through your brain. And then when they take a picture, they see where the air bubble is, and where the air bubble is a different density because it's air from the brain, and so you get a contrast between the air and the brain, and so you could see the pieces of the brain. As I said, it was painful. Of course, getting air bubbles sent through your bloodstream into your brain is not good, and being flipped all over the place upside down and everything to move that air bubble makes you nauseated, and so this new technique was very good in and of itself for getting rid of having to do that technique. But they still needed to improve. They needed to get this faster. And in the next video, I'll go ahead and discuss what were some of the first actual medical scanners. How did they work? And of course, how did that evolve over time to what we have today in terms of CAT scans. So, I hope this was clear, and until next time.